Hello and welcome to Unstress. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am recording this podcast, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. A culture which has not only been in this country for 65,000 plus years, but also a culture that has much to teach us about connection and respect for land and other people, in fact, for everything. Well, today we have, for the first time in over 500 podcasts that I've done, we're talking to an economist, and an economist whose focus is very much on the economy of well-being. My guest today is Professor Gigi Foster. Now, Gigi is a professor of economics at the University of New South Wales. She's formerly educated at Yale University, where she did ethics, politics, and economics. And she got her PhD in economics at the University of Maryland. She works in diverse fields, including education, social influence, corruption, lab experiments, time use, behavioural economics, and Australian policy, and as well as you will hear, the economics of well-being. Gigi was named Young Economist of the Year by Economic Society of Australia, and Professor Foster has filled numerous roles of service to the profession and engages heavily on economic matters within the Australian community. Professor Foster is one of Australia's leading economic commentators. Her regular media appearance includes co-hosting The Economists, a national economics talk radio program and podcast series which premiered in 2018, and you can hear that on ABC Radio National. I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Professor Gigi Foster. Welcome to the show, Gigi.
Thanks for having me on, Ron. It's a pleasure.
Gigi, this is the first time I have had in over 500 podcasts, the first time I've ever had an economist on the program. But of course, when we met the other night and we talked about it, I realized what a gap that was in a holistic approach to the world. Could it be any more fundamental than it's the economics, stupid? Didn't someone say that? It's the economy, stupid. Anyway, I know your passion is the economics of well-being, which there it is, the link to our program. And I wondered if you could just tell us what your interest in all of that has been.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm very happy to be representing the discipline on your show. I hope that I give it a good representation, a fair representation. I think hopefully a more accurate representation than many of your audience may presently have about what economics is. A lot of people in this country particularly think that economics is really just about finance, about investment, stock markets, profit, sort of the general corporate world. That's not why I got into economics at all. And in fact, none of that stuff is very motivating to me. We don't in economics really try to maximize something that you can measure in a monetary or material way. What we are trying to maximize is human welfare, human well-being. But we do that often through focusing on things that are a lot easier to measure. So traditionally in economics, for example, we've looked at GDP per capita, gross domestic product per capita, because that measure, which is essentially a measure of the amount of production or consumption that's happening in your country for each person in that country, is as a measure of well-being, as a measure of welfare, not too bad. It's a pretty good measure. It's pretty well correlated with human happiness, quality of life, length of life, human thriving. So it's related to the things that we actually care about. And it is also measured across many, many countries. And so it's easy to keep a score and to keep track of it and to gauge your relative position as a given country. So that's why we focus on things like that. We also focus on other kinds of aggregates like labor market aggregates, the unemployment rate or the inflation rate, not because those are themselves important or sort of the key or the maximand of the discipline. The maximand of the discipline is total welfare. We get to maximum total welfare when a lot of things are in the right place in some sense. We have efficient markets, we have capacity utilization. We have people who are engaged in meaningful work, contributing to various aspects of the economy in paid and unpaid ways. We have producers who are making innovative experimentations and discoveries all over the place that are competing with each other so that nobody gets too comfortable and can't exploit the consumer. So there's a lot of features of a society and economy that make it healthy and make it able to deliver human well-being. And we really can never, haven't gotten a perfect measure yet of what all of those things sort of look like as one measure. And so that's why we often use a lot of different measures. But I'm happy to talk about a particular measure that I've used a lot, particularly during the COVID period, which is arguably the closest thing we've got to a direct target that is really related to human well-being in a very direct way.
Well, I think one of the, and obviously we're going to go on and talk about that in your wonderful book, The COVID Panic, The Great COVID Panic. But the thing that always intrigued me about GDP was if I drove to work and had a day at work, that would be one thing. But if I drove to work and had an accident and I ended up in hospital and my car was a write-off and I'd incur lots of bills and I'd have to buy a new car, that incident is actually good for GDP.
That's right. I mean, the classic example we use is that, remember the Exxon Valdez disaster? Mm-hmm. That increased GDP. Right?
Yes,
that was
yes.
a good thing, right? And
yes.
We know this. We know that GDP includes some things that it shouldn't. It also doesn't include some things that it should. So, happy relationships, arguably the most fundamental input to our human happiness at a very deep level, that's nowhere in GDP. When a woman spends more time teaching her kids to write, at the dinner table, and it's not monetized, that, there's nowhere does that appear in our statistics, right? And so there are obvious indicators of human welfare and thriving and good stuff that we simply cannot measure in GDP. Here's another little fun fact for your audience. Back when the GDP figures were first sort of being devised and people were talking about what should we include, how should we measure it, one of the minority opinions didn't really carry the day, but a minority opinion that was aired was that we shouldn't include any activity in what were called the persuasive industries. This is marketing, advertising, right? Anything where you're trying to get somebody to do something. And the argument was, well, that's not productive. That's just, a lot of hot air. It's fluff, right? And so that doesn't really represent thriving of a country. But like the Mensheviks, they got shot down. So now we do include, income and expenditure in marketing. But one can make the argument, like with that, with many other things, that, well, should it be or should it not be in GDP? The argument is that really carries the day most of the time is, what we've got is something that's been used for decades and it's measured in a very similar way across countries. And therefore, it's useful as a comparator and it gives us a bellwether, even if it's an imperfect one.
Now, even before we do dive into your alternate or better way of doing it, which has to be better in my opinion, I haven't even heard it, but it has to be better, is that that this all kicked off around the time of Reagan and Thatcher in the 1980s. With neoliberalism and the whole market-driven economy. And I think what it definitely has delivered is a huge wealth to few, and for the rest of us, access to finance to aspire to that lifestyle. It's put us all under debt. I mean, it's a great economic model. I'm not sure it's a great model for well-being. What are your thoughts?
So much to say about that. First of all, the conversation about GDP was happening decades before that, right? So we have measures of GDP that go back quite a lot longer than that, several decades. But you're quite right that there was a lot of conversation around in the 80s about liberalizing markets. And by that, we basically mean putting more control of resources into the hands of private companies and less in the hands of government. Now, I will say in a general sense that a highly competitive market, that is a market in which you have suppliers who can enter and exit the market freely, you have many different suppliers, there's not a cost of entry, customers can find out information about the goods very easily, and they can decide and access which good they want very easily. That is a wonderful thing for human well-being, for human thriving, because that allows the customer to have choice, and it puts pressure on the suppliers to keep their products quality and to make sure they aren't gouging, because if they gouge, then another supplier will undercut them, right? So competition in that sense is a very, very good thing. That's why we economists argue for more competition in as many markets as we can get. And by the way, here in Australia, we don't have particularly strong competition in a lot of our markets. And it's one of the reasons why we end up with a lot more inequality, a lot more waste, a lot more inefficiency than in many other countries in various different markets. But I will confess right now, and I'm happy to do so, that I do not know what neoliberalism means. I've never known. I think that what people have in mind when they say the word is something about trying to change the structure of an economy to be more run by private companies, have again more resources in the hands of private companies than governments. But I mean, what exactly? I mean, it sounds like a bad word. It sounds like it's a bit of a swear word. So I'm not really sure why. What the alternative would be, presumably, I guess, would be having the government have a lot of control over many different industries. And we know how that goes because we've seen how communism, works and or doesn't work. I mean, I studied Russian history for a long time and speak a bit of Russian. And in school, I went to Moscow actually and observed right after the fall of the Soviet Union what that society was like, and it was very bleak. Communism was not a good system for human well-being, for human thriving. There were shortages. There was just a whole huge amount of bureaucracy that was completely not helping the society. It was just a burden on everybody. Everyone had to work around the system by the end in order to get anything done. And what you see in that kind of disaster is the reality that no one in a central location can possibly know all of the details about prices and quantities and demand and conditions that a person on the street, the man on the street looking around and saying, here, I have some money, what am I going to do with it? Knows, right? He knows. He can see all at the coalface, all these local signals. The guy in Canberra or wherever cannot see those signals. And so it's just not ever going to be efficient for that guy in Canberra to decide how much gets produced of this product or that product or the other product. So, the deregulation or the pushing into the private enterprise of various different types of production in the economy can be a very good thing. And I think that has happened to an extent. I mean, I won't say that all of the Thatcher-Reagan reforms were good, but there was definitely a liberalization that did benefit people. One can argue that now what we've got, and I've argued this a lot, we've got a lot of inequality within countries that has grown since that time, not because of economics, but because of political dynamics. So if you're interested in that, I would refer your readers to the book Rigged, which is basically about corruption, grey corruption in Australia. And it documents how favor exchange throughout many, many different industries here basically supports the theft from the Australian public of vast quantities of money from people who are unaware of it, basically, right into the pockets of those who are in control in industry and government in our society. And so I think the observation that we have a problem is correct, but I think it's wrong to lay the cause of that problem at the feet of economics or markets or private enterprise.
But isn't you draw the comparison between communism on one hand and where we are now in our current economic in the other. And I think something happened in 1929 and the Depression, which kind of forced governments to become more involved. In fact, if they hadn't become more involved, things would have gone really poorly. And then that led to periods. Listen, this is really, I'm not an economist, but just in my head, that this was going on for like through the war. The war then kicked the economy on even more, Second World War. And then we came into the 50s and the 60s, and Labor was really getting a fair deal here in the 60s. And people kind of thought, hang on, this has just gone too far. Labor is getting too strong. Governments are too involved. We need to make a change. And that change came about in the late 70s. And we've been on this trajectory ever since, which has led to, you talk about favor exchange. Boy, I mean, I wonder, when I think of government for the people, by the people, I'm kind of thinking it's now more like government for the corporations by the corporations.
So,
is that what you're saying there?
So very interesting sketch of your worldview, the post-1929 worldview. I don't agree with all of it, but it's certainly one take. I do agree about the government and just generally public service bureaucracy having been captured very strongly by the interest of money and power. And I've written about that in the Great COVID Panic and also quite a lot extensively on Brownson Institute. So I'd advise your listeners, if you're interested in these issues, have a look at Brownson Institute. It's just brownstone.org. And there's a set of blogs by myself and my co-authors, Paul Frieders and Michael Baker, that explore these sorts of issues. And indeed, not just where we are now, but where we should go in the future in order to try to improve things for humans, for people, because that is the goal, right? A corporation doesn't have life. A corporation's welfare is not the maximum of economics. It's the individual in collective, the individual welfare that we care about. And so we need to move back, I agree with you, to a system of polity where it is the voice of the people that directs resource allocation when that resource allocation is done by a central authority. And to do that, got some ideas involving direct democracy, but we won't probably get into those. In terms of what was happening in let's say, the Thatcher-Reagan era, where they were starting from, I mean, remember that when Reagan took power, the top marginal tax rate was something like 90%. So that means you're keeping 10% of every additional dollar you earn after a certain amount, right? That's under almost anybody's, judgment, pretty punishing.
Yeah.
And
yes,
so
no, I'd agree with that.
it was
Definitely
quite easy, right? Quite easy to generate some economic stimulus by reducing that, right? And so that was reasonable. Now, people today talk about reducing, the corporate tax rate from 32% to 30% or something like that. Is nothing like what Reagan was facing. Right. There's just a completely different world. And by the way, it's not the tax rate per se that you can get the big bang out of anyway, because of the fact that there's such a kind of Gordian knot, as we describe on one of our Brownstone articles, of interests related to company profitability and government power and media messaging. And there's this whole kind of connected bunch of interests that are running things that if that tax rate goes up or down a little bit, it almost doesn't matter. Like somebody will, it'll be figured out some way so that the impact on the company is minimized. So in order for the people to actually be able to get more of their resources, we need to have a much more radical solution than simply fiddling around on the edges with marginal tax rates for companies, which, by the way, are often able to hide their wealth anyway, or just not get taxed at all because they declare that all their income is in the Seychelles or something like that, which is quite a common thing. So tax reform is another area that my co-authors and I are certainly thinking about in terms of where we need to go from here.
And I want to get on. I want to talk about all of that, but I just kind of back to that period because I think they also call it economic rationalism. And I know that we all used to own Telstra and the banks and services, everything we used to own, and then it was privatized, and then we were given finance to buy stuff that we used to own. Mm-hmm. Is that economic rationalism or irrationalism? I'm not sure.
I don't even know what rational means anymore, honestly, Ron. I mean, people in economics often talk about rational as being sort of consistent with principles that emerge or are baked into very stylized models of human behavior, where very important motivations like love and loyalty and power and group influence are completely omitted. So, I mean, these are the kinds of things that I've been studying for decades now. And that's basically my life's work. Certainly before COVID, that was what I intended to do. I intended to keep working on improving our understanding and our ability to make tractable phenomena that are core motivators for the human being, but are just basically missing from most of our economic models. And that, when we behave in line with those motivations, we're called irrational. So then hugging our children is irrational, right? So when we say economic rationalism, I don't, again, it's like neoliberal. It doesn't help me. Right? It's like, what are we really talking about? Let's get down to brass tacks. Are we talking about privatizing an industry like telecommunications, which, by the way, happened in the US as well, right? We had Ma Bell. Ma Bell got broken up. And we have now, all the various different little telecommunications industries. And the logic behind that is the logic I explained before, which is that if you have more competition, it's good for the consumer. That's the logic. The logic was not, we need to make these people richer. It's the opposite, actually. It's the antitrust argument. And the antitrust argument is grounded in a belief that consumer welfare should be the principal priority that you're aiming for. So we have, for example, here in Australia, the ACCC, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. They evaluate proposed mergers or takeovers or other kinds of actions in the markets to see whether or not the competitive effects would be negative for the consumer. That is the whole idea of that watchdog group. So the idea that somehow there's nothing that's supporting the consumer is wrong, right? We do have some institutions that are trying valiantly to push for the consumer, but it's just there's a huge mountain against which you're pushing now, yes. Which again is not related to economics per se. It's much more related to politics and power and we've really taken our eye off the ball in the last 30 years. We've just sort of wanted to lay back and have a barbecue, particularly in Australia, and let whoever's in power just be in power. And we just trusted that he or she is going to make decisions that are in our best interest. Well, that hasn't happened. And if you ever needed any proof, look at the last 3 years. We have been delivered incredible destruction by our leadership. We've been betrayed on almost every level by the Australian leadership. And Australian people still haven't, in large part, actually woken up to that, because it is just such a shocking admission, a shocking realization. Oh my gosh, these people have done this to us. But if you look in history, it really shouldn't be that shocking, because when you're given power, you become a different person. You become corrupted. It's one of the reasons I try to resist powerful positions as much as I can in my life. Or if I have one, do a lot of other things too, and keep myself close to the coalface, keep myself close to people by surrounding myself with other kinds of people, having conversations with people who I disagree with, cleaning my own house, doing things that just keep you grounded, because power is a corrupting influence. We've known this for decades, and we've just forgotten about it and placed blind trust in these powerful people and institutions. And that trust has been rewarded with basically what it was worth, which is a big slap in the face. So we really need to get less apathetic, get more activated in this country if we want to reclaim what is left of our democracy and start directing the resource allocation decisions that are happening all around the bureaucracy towards what is good for the people instead of what is good for the elites.
Well, music to my ears, Gigi, and your interest in economics of well-being segues, your historical interest in economics of well-being segues into the book that you then found yourself writing, with your co-author, The Great COVID Panic, and talk about the economics of well-being. Yes, there it is, The Great COVID Panic. I mean, there's something in the title of the book that gives it away.
Yeah, you might say so.
You might say that. We're not going to be putting that in the title of this podcast, but don't want to attract too much attention. But it's relevant. We're actually talking about the economics of well-being and using the last 3 years as a case study for that.
Yep.
What tell us about the book? Why you wrote it? I mean, it's almost obvious, but tell us about the book and tell us a bit about what the whole thesis of it is. And as I said, the name gives it a little bit away, but I'm sure there's more to it than 3 words.
Oh, for sure. And I certainly talk about the well-being aspect that is so central to the book. I mean, in March 2020, like many of us in the resistance now, I was very dismayed at what was happening, and I felt like maybe I was going crazy, and rather than the world going crazy. And so I tried to sanity check myself with my co-authors and eventual co-authors. Of course, the book didn't exist at that point, point yet, and with my family and whatnot, and decided after a few days, okay, yeah, it's the world that's going crazy, not me. And then just, spent the next few months, just in amazement at what was going on and how many very, very destructive decisions were happening. And I could see the damage that was being caused so clearly. And it just seemed that all that damage was simply not being acknowledged by the people making these decisions. Nobody was thinking about the costs of these lockdown policies, particularly, and the social distancing policies, the policy that you must leave your mother alone in the aged care home for her quote unquote protection and not hug her. This kind of cruel and unusual punishment of human beings was being marketed as the safe thing to do. It just was absolutely insane. And, as I guess a bit of a libertarian, I'm not completely libertarian, but I very much believe in the right of an individual person to do and say what he or she truly believes and feels is his or her expression of self and, authentic decision. And for a grandmother not to be able to decide, I would like to take the risk. Thank you. I've seen the data. I realize there's a bit of a risk here, but I'm going to load up on my vitamin D and my zinc, and I'm going to hug my grandchildren, darn it, right? Because this might be my last day on earth. I mean, for her not to be able to make that decision just was incredibly offensive to my sensibilities in that dimension. And so after a few months of this, I of course, I was expecting that the government would eventually justify its decisions on the basis of what is typically used to evaluate economic policy in this country and other Western countries, which is a cost-benefit analysis. This is where you take a policy and you try to estimate based on the current data, and it's never a perfect amount of data. You never have the perfect measures, but you try the best you can to estimate the costs and the benefits of a policy. And you only embark upon a policy if in your considered estimation on reflection, the expected benefits are likely to exceed the expected costs. This is pretty sensible. It's not rocket science. And this is how we evaluate policies traditionally. In fact, with the AUKUS submarine purchase, you'll notice that was exactly what people were starting to do. They were saying, well, what benefits are we going to get? This is a big cost. Is this really worth it? Very sensible, very natural thing to ask. And you also ask, what else could we do with that money, right? Like, what other things could we buy? So in the case of the lockdowns, nobody was asking these questions. But I kept expecting naively that the government must have done a cost-benefit analysis and just hadn't produced it. It turns out no. And even now, even today, no government around the world has actually produced a cost-benefit analysis that defends the lockdowns. And the reason is, Ron, that you can't. If you start out trying to do any kind of reasonable estimation of costs and benefits, knowing, what we knew in March 2020, not just knowing what we know now, knowing what we knew then about the virulence of the disease and the kinds of effects that lockdowns were going to cause, particularly on human well-being, including in the short run, when you lock people in their homes, you would never have chosen them. You would never have done so if your maximand was health of the population, right? Now, why did we get lockdowns anyway? Because that was not the maximand. The maximand was power protection of profits, other kind of political and economic imperatives of the elites. So that was what was driving the policies, not health of the population.
But coming back to some of our discussion earlier, because part of this economic model that we live in is the beauty that we have competition, and we have competition within media, giving its various views. We have competition between, you shouldn't really call it competition, but there's varying opinions, medical opinions. This shouldn't be interpreted as competition, but it's part of a vibrant democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I think it's called modern medicine. I used to think it was called modern medicine, where doctors would have a different opinion and respect the fact that each were entitled to explain that and defend it with so-called evidence. I mean, how did we go downhill in this wonderful competitive environment so quickly?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think it wasn't as competitive as you make out, even at the start.
I was being sarcastic.
I mean, that is certainly the ideal. However, I mean, I agree with you. Of course, it is an aspect of life that you can think of applying the economic competitive model to, right? So you do want ideas to compete in the marketplace, and you want the best idea to come out on top, right? So, in fact, during this time, I've wanted to discuss these issues with many people on the other side, and multiple times people have declined to be in public fora with me discussing them. I think because that the other side is simply indefensible on the basis of arguments. It's just indefensible. If you actually want to say that this was really maximizing human health, right? If you want to say that it was maximizing the power of the incumbent politicians, then sure, you can make an argument. But I don't think that that's the maximum we should be pursuing in this country, right? That's not what we're on about, right? So I've had multiple, people say, no, I won't discuss things with you. And of course, we've seen incredible amounts of censorship and bullying of dissidents and coercion and just smearing, defamation. I was defamed on Twitter, even though I'm not even on Twitter. I mean, ridiculous amounts of suppression. And it's really, akin to what you would see in a totalitarian state. And that has been a defiling of the ideals of discourse and freedom and really the Enlightenment, right? Where you're supposed to be able to be free to express what you think and discuss with other people openly and objectively and with respect for the other person, and not be hurling ad hominem attacks, but actually get into the meat of the issue. The closest thing that I've seen to that is actually a forum that was organized by the Brisbane Dialogues organization up in Brisbane about, I guess maybe a few months ago now. And I was on that stage together with some other people who were not of my opinion about the COVID policies. And we had a very civil, respectful discussion about the issues. And I mean, that was wonderful. It was like, having some oxygen finally, right, for what we have needed during this time. And I hope that similar discussions happen across Australia. That was with some of the people who wrote Fault Lines, which, as you know, is a philanthropically funded review of the COVID policy decisions, the earliest one, really, that I've seen. And I do expect we're going to see many, many more. Anyway, so
yes.
I mean, I do think you're right that what we want is that free exchange. We didn't have that, and we've seen during COVID the corruption of science. In fact, many scientific institutions in which many of us thought, we had faith, we could trust, really have just been proven to have been totally corrupted now. And so I think this is one of the big motivators for people putting effort now towards thinking about building new institutions, educational institutions, scientific institutions, health institutions. And I think that's the direction for the resistance going forward, to really promote more restoration of what we used to have in the West and what we see as the ideal.
But isn't part of the problem, and you talk about regulatory bodies like the Australian Securities, what was the one, say the one again,
ASIC?
Securities?
No, Securities, ASIC or?
Yeah. ASIC.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You talk about that. But the problem partly is that a lot of these regulatory bodies are funded by the very industries. I mean, I know ASIC's not, but if you look at the TGA, for example, the Therapeutic Goods Association, 96% of its funding comes from the pharmaceutical industry, and it is in charge of regulating the pharmaceutical industry. Now, I can only imagine there could be, again, I'm being sarcastic here, I should preface it, with some conflict of interest there. And I think in America, the similar is the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. And I think a lot of universities now having to go to corporates for their funding, and they have to, journals need corporate funding for them to survive. So again, yes, we've got all this wonderful competition, but is it really competition?
I mean, well, you're exactly right. Of course, there's a huge amount of, this is what I was talking about before, this overlap, the Gordian knot problem. And it's not really competitive. If you look at the mainstream media, even if you look at politics in this country, labor and liberal policies are virtually indistinguishable. They make a huge song and dance about tiny little differences. And the reality is that there really isn't a difference in terms of what they're proposing as a model, as a vision for society. So the same thing is true in the mainstream media about pretty much any issue. I remember that there was a time when you couldn't say anything against the COVID vaccinations, anything at all. You couldn't say anything. I mean, you couldn't talk about any potential cost or everybody really need it? You couldn't say anything about that without being literally taken off the air immediately, right? And it's only now that so many people have worked around the world to bring to light some of the stories of vaccine injuries and deaths and some of the real data that was available again at the time in March, that young people are simply not particularly at risk of this thing. And we don't know the long-term effects of some of these vaccine products. You can now say it, but only because of that really, really hard work. And the mainstream media, are simply in line they just say what they are told to say by their corporate sponsors. That's just clearly true. They're basically just bought and sold. So this is, again, why the direction for reform is to establish new institutions. We can do that. We still have freedom in this country to do those things. And in fact, this podcast is a really good example. There are plenty of people around the country who have started new media channels, and I've been on a lot of them talking about this sorts of stuff because I obviously want to support those new truly competitive channels, and they have much more diversity across them than I see in the mainstream media. Some people are really, really, rabidly anti-vaccination of any sort. Other people are, I'm not sure about the vaccine, whatever, but I'm more interested in the lockdowns. And other people are, interested in sort of the politics of everything. Other people are about the psychology or meditative aspects, or, there's all different little focuses, which is wonderful to see. That's the thousand flowers blooming And from that smorgasbord of options, the listener can choose, some message that resonates with him, and he can evaluate the veracity of the different sources. And that's kind of what we have in our mind as an ideal of competition in the media space. But at the moment, the mainstream media is just propaganda. So, essentially, if you see something on the mainstream media, you should assume that probably the opposite is true.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting to hear you use the word mainstream media, and nowhere there have you used the word news.
Yeah.
I similarly have stopped referring to any of these outlets as news. They are the media outlets. You talked about a different measure of the health of an economy than GDP. I wondered if you might share that with us.
Sure.
What's a better way of measuring it?
Yeah. So going back, just casting our mind back to 2020, when I was waiting for the cost benefit analysis that never came, I actually had a lovely invitation to address the Victorian State Parliament, and I used that opportunity in August 2020 to lay out a draft cost benefit analysis of lockdown policies. It was just on 4 pages. And I used for that analysis this new currency, which is called the Wellbeing, which stands for the Wellbeing Year. And it's built from a question that's asked on many social science surveys worldwide, which is, overall, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? And that question is answered on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is not at all satisfied and 10 is extremely satisfied. Most healthy people who are in Australia or a similar Western country would answer around an 8 on that scale. Most people and there are many of them, thankfully, who are kind of on the border of indifference between life and death because their life is so difficult, would answer around a 2. So the way that the Wellbeing is built is the Wellbeing is essentially one increment on that 0 to 10 scale enjoyed for one person for 1 year. And if you think about that difference between the healthy answer and the life or death is about the same answer, about 6 increments, about 6 Wellbeings is enjoyed for one person for 1 year is kind of equivalent to one healthy life year enjoyed by one person for 1 year, which coincidentally is the definition of the quality adjusted life year that you may be familiar with, that some of your listeners may be familiar with, because it's a currency that's used quite frequently in health economics. It's used in normal times to make decisions about what pharmaceuticals to buy, what kinds of medical interventions to buy by the TGA. Yeah? When negotiating with drug companies. And basically we say, look, if your new pill or new device gives us one more quality, we're willing to spend up to $100,000 for that device. If it costs more than that for one quality, we're not interested. Yeah?
Just define that quality again for us. And it's spelled
QALY, quality adjusted
QAL.
life year. Yeah. And it's related to some other currencies like the DALY, the disability adjusted life year. But quality is the thing that's used most in our negotiations with pharmaceutical companies in normal times. And it's essentially one healthy life year lived by a person. Right? It's one quality adjusted life year. The quality equals 1 if your life is perfectly healthy for 1 year. And to the extent that you have suffering during that year, then the quality number comes down. So maybe 0.8 if you might be having some serious problems with mobility, or if you have a blindness, or if you have some other kind of health problem. The thing about the quality is it's generally confined to health measures. It's not asking the more general question about life satisfaction, which is the question that underlies the Wellbeing. And so the reason I used the Wellbeing in this case is because many of the effects of the lockdowns were happening in real time when you lock people away in their homes. They suffer mentally, they suffer in their heart, and they will evaluate their life satisfaction at a lower level if they're locked down than if they're not, which means we are directly causing suffering, but it's suffering that's difficult to pick up on any other measures. It's not going to be really, it's certainly not going to be in GDP if JobKeeper is captured in GDP, which it was. And you're not going to have like a statistic that we are already capturing through ABS surveys that really measures this. But we have that question, which is run even on the ANU poll. There's a monthly survey about well-being, and you can see, looking at the historical data, that people under lockdowns did indeed evaluate their life satisfaction a few sort of tenths of a point less during lockdown than they do normally. So we saw that fall. We saw it as well overseas in the UK, that there was a decline in life satisfaction during lockdowns. So what I do in my cost benefit analysis is I say, well, there's a number of different categories of costs. One of them is this direct effect on misery, basically human well-being, human thriving when people are locked down. And if you imagine that amount of reduction in life satisfaction across everybody who's locked down, that becomes a huge number, a huge amount of human thriving that we are extracting from the system unseen when we lock the economy down. So that's item one in the cost benefit analysis. The other really big item, because the two items that are the biggest are these two, and then there's a bunch of other ones which we can talk about, but the other one is the debt. So when we take on a huge amount of debt in order to finance basically just treading water, and trying to help people through the disastrous policy decision that was already made, which was the lockdowns, through JobKeeper, through other expenditures by the government, which by the way is what we call fiscal policy, then we are accumulating debt, and that debt eventually will have to be repaid. And when that debt is repaid, that means we won't have as much money in future to spend on everything else that makes life worth living. And government expenditure is known to produce human well-being. That's why we do it, right? We produce hospitals. We spend the money that we've collected in taxes in some sense. It's not exact, but we use the government's authority to spend on infrastructure, hospitals, education facilities, lots of things that are good for people. That's why we do it. Otherwise, we wouldn't do it, supposedly, right? And so if we have to pay off debt in the future, then there's going to be some crowd out of those expenditures. And so that's the other really big cost of the lockdowns and the associated policies, which is that we spent like drunken sailors in a low interest rate environment, by the way, right? And we can talk about monetary policy and the RBA's mistakes later, maybe. But that happened. It was huge. And then there was a number of other costs. And so in this August 2020 CBA draft that I shared with the Victorian Parliament, I just enumerated those two, plus a few other ones. I mentioned other costs like to children's productivity when you take them out of school, crowded out healthcare when you suspend cancer screenings and whatnot, and a number of other kinds of issues that were occurring to me that we just didn't have good data on. And then I kept waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting for the government to say, oh, well, thank you. Now we know what we should do. I'll go back in the back room and use the machinery of state to come up with a proper, fleshed out CBA. No, of course, this didn't happen. And so I eventually set my hand to penning my own cost benefit analysis. And here it is. So there we are. Do lockdowns and border closures serve the greater good? So I wrote this together with Sanjeev Sadlock. I don't know if you can see his name on
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Sanjeev was a Victorian Treasury economist until they kicked him out, or I suppose they parted ways because they disagreed about COVID policy. But he's an excellent economist, backroom government economist, whose bread and butter is to do cost-benefit analysis-based evaluation of government policy. So we essentially expanded the August 2020 draft into this full book-length exposition of the costs and benefits of COVID policy. And what we find in there, using the currency of the well-be as our primary currency, so we're looking at human well-being on both sides of the equation, benefits and costs, we find that the cost of the lockdowns were at a minimum 68 times the value of their plausible benefits.
Wow. Yeah. And you really walked into the lion's den there, because in terms of lockdown, I mean, there was no place more, I suppose China took that away, but Melbourne, Victoria was the lockdown capital of the world.
It was, and this is on.
It wasn't post August 2020, Gigi. You didn't have a reverse impact.
I
mean, they just went into complete. I mean, they really suffered.
It was awful, and I was getting emails. I mean, every time I'd be on ABC Q&A or 60 Minutes or another one of these channels where people would see me, I would get the most desperate and sweet and almost just incredibly grateful emails from people who were clearly suffering. I mean, I cried many nights during this time because it just, you see the heartache that is being caused by government policy, and it's just not right. It's just ethically, morally offensive. And so this just really kept me motivated. And, obviously we started writing The Great COVID Panic soon after that appearance that I had at the Victorian Parliament's Accounts and Estimates Committee, because my co-authors and I had just been tearing our hair out trying to argue against these things and not getting anywhere. And so we thought we've got to write a book. So we ended up writing it, and we brought on Michael Baker, who is an excellent lay economist, sort of a good writer for the common man, and previous books that health writers and I have written have been a little bit more, I don't know, esoteric or a little more academically written and not as accessible. So Michael was a great addition. And so we set to work writing. We had a final draft around May of 2021 and sent it out to a few people who had been saying sensible things about lockdowns around the world. And one of those people was Jeffrey Tucker, who at the moment now is running Brownstone Institute, but at the time was just writing for the American Institute for Economic Research. And he stayed up all night reading the manuscript and got back to me and said, look, who's publishing this book? And our plan had been to self-publish because we thought there's no publisher is going to touch this manuscript with a barge pole. But then he got back to me a couple hours later and said, let me rephrase, I must publish this book, right? And we said, well, do you have a publishing house? You're just a staff writer on who are you, right? And he said, no, I'm planning this new institute, right? And at the time it didn't have a name, but it became Brownstone Institute. And there was a bit of a roller coaster after that. Will he or will he not get enough money to publish? And anyway, finally it was yes. And then we got him the final manuscript at the beginning of August. And it was published on 1st of September. So amazingly fast turnaround. And the first book for Brownstone Institute. So we're very pleased with that. And it has, been a very cathartic thing for us to be able to offer during this time.
And very good, I'm sure, for you to be able to put things down in, writing a book is very cathartic in itself. But on this topic, I can imagine it being particularly so. Do you think part of the problem, though, was that as soon as an emergency use authorization was issued, then medical officers assumed authority way beyond what they normally had? Was that an issue, do you think?
Well, sure, but I would say it's just a drop in the ocean. I mean, there were many, many other things going on, many other very big drivers of what happened. Again, that Gordian knot problem. There was just the problem of the crowd psychology. Many of us in the resistance had this experience during the 2020-2021 period of trying to reach people using arguments, and sense. And it was like throwing spaghetti against the wall. It just wouldn't stick, right?
Yeah.
And we just thought, again, tearing the hair out, thinking, what has happened to your brain? Well, I'll tell you what has happened to their brain. And it's something that my co-authors and I, have really been grateful to be able to observe up close because we haven't seen it in our lifetimes previously, is the creation of a crowd, the creation of a herd mentality, where the brain of a crowd member becomes hijacked by the crowd and becomes then a slave to defending whatever it is that the crowd says today is the truth. So your brain becomes a rationalization machine. It is no longer capable of independent thought and evaluation of evidence that comes in the door and through the senses. And our brains are extremely powerful. So if they get captured and hijacked, that's it. We can be a very effective rationalizer and justifier of pretty much anything, right? It's just the things we've been taught not to rationalize. Like you think about, for example, some of the atrocities of some of the world wars or other wars, regional wars. You've been taught that you're not supposed to rationalize, Pol Pot's killings, for example. But it's okay to rationalize, the actions of various medical professionals when they're giving these vaccines that they don't know the long-term effects of to people who are not at risk of COVID. Right? We're not supposed to, right? So that kind of sort of doublethink is completely possible for humans. And that crowd mentality is a real problem in reaching people, even now, because people are still captured by the crowd narrative. And it's really only waking up people one by one that we can hope to make any progress.
We just did a program a few weeks back with the World Authority on Compassion-Focused Therapy, Professor Paul Gilbert, and he talked about the system which goes on in our brain of being confronted with a threat, taking action, and then needing to soothe. And if we don't reach that soothing area, then we're in a cycle of trauma from which no one wants to be. So when the soothing is offered to you in the form of a one-shot thing, it's very appealing, particularly for a society that has become very used to a pill for every ill and has led to a $1.5 trillion pharmaceutical industry. We've all contributed to that. But in terms of threat, action, soothing, relating it back to what we talked a few weeks ago about, this is a classic example of that, isn't it? And it's worth reminding our listener that I think the chance of someone dying from COVID below the age of 60 was something like 0.04%. So that meant you were 99.96% likely not to die.
That's right. And that's based on population figures where not everybody in the population did all of the things they could do to prevent infection or prevent serious disease from developing. And we know that there's an awful lot of prophylactic and early treatment approaches that now exist and are very effective. So even that figure is, I think, higher than it would have to be if we actually took actions that really promoted health, right? So you see the suppression of early treatment as, again, just a marker that what was being maximized was not health. It was power and profitability. And so, yes, and I think in terms of the soothing aspect, being in a crowd itself is a reward for people psychologically. It makes you feel like you've got a tribe, you have security, you're with other people who are pushing in the same direction. And if you're very scared of some external threat like COVID, people were very, very scared. Was how we start out the great COVID panic, as reliving that intense fear that people had. Then you are looking for a way to to take an action and get some comfort, get some succor. And so the action you can take is stay at home, sacrifice, basically, right? It's a religious request from the government. Sacrifice towards this, this god of COVID almost, right? By taking your kids out of school and stopping your work and not seeing your family and all this stuff. It's very difficult, but we will get there in the end. We're all together, right? So there's this soothing aspect that comes with it as well, without any querying of the connection between the sacrifice and the supposed desired outcome, which is supposedly less suffering, right? At least less suffering from COVID. But it looks as though lockdowns probably didn't even do that, right? They didn't even give us less suffering from COVID. If you look at the amount of people who have now died of COVID after the lockdowns have all ended, we may have delayed maybe 10,000 deaths by maybe a year or two. And these are mainly of people in their, elder years who have comorbidities. Maybe we've done that. That's about the best we can claim for lockdowns. But we may have, many more deaths in total now from COVID, because of all of these actions that we took, which actually on net made people much less healthy. And that's not even counting all of the other deaths and suffering that we have created with these policies.
Yes, and we kind of factor in mental health into that area as well. And I think the other thing that was a problem was the word vaccine had been hijacked because, vaccines have done some great things through history. I think if it had been called, you go and get your novel genetic therapy and join a phase 4 clinical trial. I'm not sure what the acronym for that would be, but it certainly doesn't spell VAX. and so it was easier to say you're an anti-vaxxer if you're against novel gene therapy.
And the amount of epithets that have been created during this time and hurled at people who had dissident views is just a sight to behold. I have a whole jar full, right? At one point, I think I was called a neoliberal, Trump cannot, death cult warrior. That was probably one of my favorites. And then, yes, we had anti-vaxxer and, anti this, anti that, anti-mandator, and, and what does that even mean? These are just ways of stopping thought. That's basically what those kinds of labels do. They stop a conversation. They let the person who's hurling the label rest mentally. They don't have to engage with the actual arguments. They just have put you in a box and they have mental peace, right? And remember, a lot of these people on the other side of the debate, shall we say, the mainstream side of the debate, have been carrying such stress and anxiety. And now they also have to carry a kind of a conscience, a weight on their conscience, because it becomes increasingly obvious that these policies were bad for people and that they may have been complicit in them is a really horrific realization if you think about it from the perspective of an individual psychology. And so there's this great moral weight somewhere in them. So there's this incredible amount of psychological pressure that people who are on the mainstream side are feeling now, and that pressure is going to be increasing as we see more and more evidence of the harms of these policies. And so those people are really going to be in need of compassion. So, to the point of what you said before with your previous guest, I've been advocating this. I mean, I'm a very sort of New Testament style sort of person. I don't think, I hope that we can avoid bloodshed after this horrific period, but I'm not sure we can. It depends on how angry our young men get, basically. But I certainly would advocate trying to be compassionate towards those who have been caught up in this madness, because it has been the vast majority of people. So if we reject them all, we're basically rejecting 80% or more of our fellow man.
Mm.
And that's not a way to rebuild the future.
Yeah, I must admit, I've seen the whole thing. When you try to make sense of what the last 3 years have been about, I think it can be summarized in two words: a business model.
Hmm.
And it's been the most successful one in history, I think. And the people, in the same way that regulatory bodies are, being paid by pharmaceutical industry, it's very hard for people to regulate themselves and be critical of themselves, particularly when it cuts across so many issues. I know whenever you write a book, once it's written, you always have got far more to say. And you reached a point in your book which said, "What's next, and what have we learned?" And I'm sure you've given that much more thought since you penned that. Where are you at now when we ask the question, "What's next, and what have we learned?"
Well,
Where should
to
we
be
go from
honest,
here?
I mean, The Great COVID Panic is a book that I think will stand the test of time. Everything in there, I stand 100% behind, even now,
Hmm.
so, 2
Yeah.
years later. And I think we've made a lot of predictions and a lot of statements that are just proving to be true now. So the way we talk about the vaccines in there, for example, that unproven and causing a lot of nasty side effects, including lethal ones. Yep, that's happening. The suppression of ivermectin and how that was an indication of the power of the pharmaceutical company lobbying for something that was more profitable, i.e., the vaccines. Yep, right. So there's just a lot of things in there that I'm very happy with. We did talk about some directions for the future, and I've gone into more depth with my co-authors on the Brownstone Institute blogs about some of those ideas in the recent past. I think the biggest things that I've been thinking about more since the book are in the area of how to encourage the renewal and strengthening of community as a response to this kind of abuse that we've experienced. Because at the end of the day, that community is something. I mean, we know we've had a fraying of the fabric of community over the last 30 or 40 years. It's one of the reasons why we were ripe for being exploited at the start of COVID. There are many other reasons for that as well that we go into in the Great COVID Panic. But to rediscover the power of community strength and community insurance. And I'm not talking about just formal, but informal, like, oh, my car is broken down. Okay, my neighbor has one I can borrow, that sort of thing. Like most people maybe listening would be thinking, oh, I never even thought of asking my neighbor, to borrow their car. But, it used to be back in the 50s, if you were short on, eggs, you could go to your neighbor. I'm baking a cake. I need a couple eggs. And the neighbor would say, sure. And then the next week, the neighbor would come over asking you for a cup of milk or whatever, right? It was this mutual insurance system that was informal, but extremely effective. And it takes away a lot of anxiety because you realize you're not Robinson Crusoe, you're not going it alone, right? We are all social creatures, and strong communities are what enable us to achieve our best, recognizing that we are part of a community. We are only one small little pebble, little cog, no matter how important you are or how brilliant you are, one cog in a grand human machine, which is beautiful at its best. And that machine is built from tiny little cogs that are themselves local communities. And it's not a Facebook community. I'm not talking about friends, virtual friends, or not friends. I'm talking about real human beings in the flesh whom you know and who you share your life with and you become with. You become a community and an individual who is at the top of their thriving potential in the context of that community. And you cannot otherwise achieve your optimum potential, I believe. And in fact, it's the strength from my own local, family community. I'm incredibly grateful to the support that I've received during this period that has enabled me to articulate these arguments and communicate and try to reach people. It gives me the strength, right? It's not just me, it's everything that I am because of the other people around me. So I think we need to recognize that, remember that. I mean, we used to know, but kind of restore that memory in our brains of what that is like and recognize that we have the freedom to create that sort of strength at the community level, which will enable us not to constantly look to government all the time to solve our problems, because frankly, they've just proven themselves that, untrustworthy, basically. All right? And so for the moment, at least, the pendulum is too far in that direction. And we need to bring it back by our own actions, by restoring our communities and then placing our trust and our faith in those communities. And it takes more work, for sure, than simply going to the polls every couple of years and ticking some box and then just hoping that things go okay and kind of whining and whinging mildly in the corner when they don't, right? That's not a way to run a healthy democratic state, right? We need to take more responsibility on our own shoulders. So I've really thought about that a lot more. and how to help individual communities. I travel around now to quite a lot of local communities on a regular basis and give talks and talk with people one-on-one about the various initiatives that they're trying to get going in their local communities, and it's incredibly inspirational. And just getting my hands really dirty with what are the practicalities involved in building those kinds of new structures. Speaking with some of the leaders of our new medical communities, for example, like AMPS, the Australian Medical Practitioners Society, and AMN, the Australian Medical Network, about directions forward, like creating something that would be a competitor to APRA, for example, right? A certifying mechanism that would be embodied in a new organization that doctors could, sign up to. A new insurance system that would cover things like, holistic care, integrative medicine, Chinese traditional medicine, but maybe wouldn't cover the latest Me Too drugs by the biopharmaceutical complex, right? These kinds of new ideas, they require a lot of brass tacks effort, collaboration, and working things through. And I think that's where we really need to be focused going forward in order to rebuild our societies and really see the existing institutions as largely beyond hope. Many of them are just so tainted with what they have been involved in during this period that they just need to be allowed to die.
Well, yeah, I think when we come out of the pandemic, I think particularly as we've been absorbed in this digital world, it was just a timely reminder of how important human contact was and is. And it's kind of confirmed by the longest study done on health and well-being out of Harvard, 80-year study, which says relationships are key, and they need work. Are you an optimist, Gigi? Are you at this, you're an optimist?
I absolutely am an optimist. And actually one of my recent blogs with Paul and Michael on the Brownstone site was talking about my optimism. And how I know a lot of people in the resistance now worry about the possibility that the globalists are going to take everybody over, and we're all going to be slaves to this global elite class. And I just think that's not going to happen for a number of reasons. Their game is up. They've been making stupid mistakes. Look at the Matt Hancock Twitter files. Look at the CDC director admitting openly that they lied. Right? I mean, these kinds of admissions are just it makes it obvious to Western populations and to people outside the West that the Western elites have betrayed their peoples. Right? And secondly, these elites are really just in the West. So the whole bloc that's forming now, Russia, China, India, potentially, a lot of other Brazil, that is anti-West, that's seeing the decay of the West and distancing themselves from that, are seeing things quite, accurately in terms of what's happening with the elites. And so it's not that the elites are really going global. They've been stopped by actually often the African nations, right? So the WHO proposals that have, presumed to establish WHO as this kind of global controller of health policy, they've been blocked by little African countries that know what colonialism is like and know what power overreach is and have said, no, good on them. We should join them, right? That's that kind of pushback. So it's not that every country in the world is captured by this. And also, and I suppose, we've talked about the vaccine injuries. I think that's something that will continue to live in the minds of people who have gone through this period. They will wonder every time they get sick, is this because I have the poison still in my body? Or, gosh, I wonder whether it was that killed my cousin, or, that kind of thing. That's pain that doesn't easily fade. And the elites are clearly associated with the vaccine rollouts. And so it's going to be very difficult to prevent those kinds of lawsuits coming after the wealth of the elites. And we're already seeing that in the US, and even here in Australia, we have now a class action on vax injuries. And perhaps the most important reason I think we've got to win is because on the side of the mainstream narrative of this time, what do we see? We see misery, anxiety, division, kind of a perpetual need to sacrifice and kind of cower at home. What we see on our side is love and freedom and joy and innovation and song and dance and Novak Djokovic, right? How can we possibly lose?
Gigi, what a way to put it. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll have links to the brownstone.org site where your blogs are. And you also have that site that you were pointing me to the other night.
Yeah, so there's a new group called Australians for Science and Freedom. This is scienceandfreedom.org. It's a new kind of a think tank that's uniting professionals from across different professions, so lawyers, economists, doctors, political theorists, all at the top of our game, and pushing for more independent free thinking about the COVID policies and where to go next in Australia. So I definitely encourage your listeners to subscribe to that.
Gigi, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure to be on. Thanks, Ron.
Well, there it is. Just so interesting to get a economist perspective, and not just any economist, an economist focused on well-being, which is, I guess, something we are all focused on. And a subject that we didn't actually touch on, and I should just touch on, we don't touch on it very often on this podcast, or at all, in fact, but the subject of death, an inevitable outcome to all of our lives. And it's sobering to look at the statistics. The average age of COVID deaths in the pandemic in Australia was 86. Now, that's 86 years old was the average age of people that died of COVID. And it's sobering to know that life expectancy in Australia is around 83. So that's kind of interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think we can all agree death is inevitable. And, the longer that we last, the better. And 86 is a pretty good age, but it's 3 years older than the life expectancy. So that's a sobering statistic. And we don't often think about how many people die in Australia, but here's a couple of statistics for you. Out of the 25 million people, in 2019, 169,000 people died. 2019. 2020, the year of the pandemic, before vaccines were available, 161,000 people died. 2021, the last available statistics that I was able to access, 171,500. So there was an additional 10,500 deaths in 2021. So I'll just repeat that. The year of the pandemic, when we were all exposed to COVID and there were no vaccines, 161,000 people died. And a year later, 171,000 people died. And there's some interesting statistics out there about an increase in all-cause mortality of about 15 to 20%, which is an interesting statistic in itself. So a cost-benefit analysis, well, you can make your own judgment. And I thought that dovetailed very interestingly into the program we did with Paul Gilbert about threat, action, and soothing. And it is very soothing to be part of a crowd, even if that crowd may be working on information that is perhaps not all that accurate. And I think one of the things that I've come to realize in this pandemic is that what I've formerly referred to as news services, that's it's media outlets. And I think that is a challenge for us all. And the reminder, and I thought this was so powerful, a message from Gigi, a reminder that community and contact is so critical. And as I said, the longest study on health well-being ever done, come out of Harvard University, is an 80-year study going back and looking at the greatest predictor of health and well-being is actually relationships. And if you're fortunate enough to have a significant other, that's one thing, but it doesn't have to be. It can be family, it can be friends, it can be community of whatever kind, sporting, church, other interests. But relationships are important. And if we had to have a reminder during the pandemic of how important physical contact with people was and how special that is and how precious life is, it's a sobering reminder. I hope we'll have links, of course, to brownstone.org and Gigi's site where she was talking about the scienceandfreedom.org, which I think is worth exploring. I think as a concept, it's well worth exploring, and I'm sure there'll be some very stimulating and interesting commentary on there. I hope this finds you well. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well.
This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.